Now I would like to discuss the concept of spirits and how we can explain the existence of spirits which are capable of either acting out good or evil. In the first book of the Bible, a spirit was placed into the body of Adam, and a spirit was placed into the body of Eve. The serpent is understood to be a spirit of the fallen angel who was once known as Lucifer. Angels, which are ministering spirits, were sent to guard the tree of life after the fall of Adam. The book of Job mentions that spirits and angels were present before the creation of the earth. Adam's physical body was formed from the dust of the earth. What was the spirit formed from? In ex nihilo theology, God created the spirits out of nothing, as God was alone eternally. In this scenario, goodness and kindness cannot be appreciated because there is no evil or wickedness. These characteristics I list here, describing God, are defined by the only substance that exists, God Himself. Anything that does not have these attributes are created by God. In order to act out mercy, God in this scenario has to create beings out of nothing that are inferior enough so that they will require charity and mercy. If imperfection exists, it is because God Himself created it from His mind. Earlier I mentioned the serpent. So let's consider Lucifer, who became Satan, and the other angels and spirits who rebelled against God. Did God know that a large portion, 1/3, would rebel before creating them out of nothing? If not, does God lack control of the characteristics of the creatures He's creating? If so, why create them in the first place? Is it because they are useful to tempt man? Are you telling me that God created thinking and feeling creatures ex nihilo that He knew before creating them would end up miserable forever? They will suffer in eternal darkness? That seems kind of cruel to me, to create these creatures out of nothing when all the while knowing how they would end up, hateful and spiritually tortured. This is the problem of evil, which is rather perplexing, especially with the unbiblical doctrine of ex nihilo creation. Occasionally, I like to remind my audience that there is substance behind my rejection of ex nihilo creation theology. Try the book called The Creation and Persistence of Evil by John D. Levinson. One review states, "This masterful biblical and rabbinic study of creation and evil may challenge Christian proponents of creation theology and spirituality and adherents of the doctrine of creation ex nihilo." Also, consider The Origin of Evil Spirits, written by Archie T. Wright in 2005. So here we go. It is understood from the Bible that we are spirits dwelling inside a physical body. Angels are generally understood to be spirits without a physical body. I have demonstrated that we should not assume that the physical universe or multiverse was created from nothing. Likewise, spirits were not created ex nihilo. In fact, philosophically and theologically speaking, I think it is more important to understand that our spirits were not entirely created from God's mind alone. In a previous video, I described this infinite potential, which has no form or order. It is unorganized or chaotic. In it consist primitive forms of energy and matter. There were not yet elements or atoms as we find in the periodic table. I imagine this as being completely raw. I also mentioned primitive forms of spirit, consciousness, or intelligence. Proponents of orthodoxy will have a problem with this, because they will feel that if something coexisted with God eternally, then it is potentially co-equal with God. I disagree with that argument. They are only co-equal in one sense, that they have always been there. One might say that there is the same quantity, but not the same quality. I can put a 4-ounce cow patty in the oven and a 4-ounce serving of cookie dough in the oven with it, and then set the timer for 10 minutes. When it's time to take them out, are you telling me that they are the same because they were in the oven the same amount of time? I'll have the cookie, thank you very much. Furthermore, these consciousnesses are lost in the chaos with no purpose, no direction, no way to progress. Without God, they would not amount to much of anything. There is a distinction between God's divine characteristics and those with non-divine characteristics. God has all power, righteousness, knowledge, perfection, mercy, and love, and more. Again, these non-divine attributes were already there. God did not create them from nothingness. And there is already a principle of free will. The true and living God has a divine moral code which limits the oppression of any of these individuals. Through some unknown spiritual process, spirits are created from the primitive forms of consciousness that exist here. The spiritual attributes and characteristics depend on the primitive intelligence that formed the spirit. This generation of spirits will have a range in terms of purity. For example, let's say that the Archangel Michael is here, a fairly pure spirit, and Lucifer is at the far end of the negative side, here. So, let's tie this back to the first video. Character. Each individual has characteristics. God is not ultimately responsible for the flaws of each soul. The core of each person has always existed. Therefore, we are entirely responsible for our own decisions. God is not to blame for our weaknesses, not to blame for our poor decisions. When we look at the biblical story of Jacob and Esau, we understand that God chose Jacob over Esau, not because God created each one differently on purpose, but instead because each individual has attributes, and each has an eternal nature that God is keenly aware of. Consider what Origen of Alexandria said on the subject of Jacob and Esau. He wrote, "We believe that he was even then chosen by God because of merits acquired before this life." Now, I don't mention this because I think that Origen was right about everything. I just want to reiterate that the concepts I am describing are not new. Ancient Christians considered these same ideas. An early church father, Clement of Alexandria, once wrote, "The Logos is not to be despised as something new. For even in Jeremiah the Lord says, 'Say not, I am too young, for before I formed thee in the womb, I knew thee. And before thou camest forth from thy mother, I sanctified thee.'" It is possible that in speaking these things, the prophet is referring to us, as being known to God as faithful before the foundation of the world. Now, the verse itself states, "Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. And before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee. And I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations." Those who defend the orthodox view of creation ex nihilo will argue that this verse is referring to God's foreknowledge. Are you sure? While it is feasible for God to foreknow someone according to that view, can you sanctify someone who does not yet exist? Did God ordain someone who is not yet created? An ordination and a sanctification seem like events to me, important events. I believe that Jeremiah existed when these events occurred.